welcome, Harbor family, friends, and guests. Man, we are so excited that you've joined us here this morning. This is a special morning, a morning that there is much to celebrate. We're so excited that you've joined us. I can't think of any better way to celebrate than for each and every one of us, no matter where we're tuning in, no matter how you're viewing this, but for us to be united in worship. And friends, there's so much to worship, so join in with us.
I'll raise a for what you accomplished through it. You gave your life and you conquered death so that we could leave our past, we could leave our sin, we could leave it all at your feet and be close to you and to know you. Jesus, we love you. Amen.
Friends, thank you for welcoming us into your living room or to wherever you're viewing this so that we can worship that truth together. He is alive. Man, that is such a great reminder for this Easter morning. I want to give you guys just a couple things before we move on into the service. The first is this. This is going to be a quick time for us to receive our offering. And so if you call the Harbor home, then there's just a few ways that you can do that. Of course, on our website and through our app that we've made available, you could mail a check in at any time throughout the week. But we've also made a new way for you to give, and that is through text message. And so there's some information on the screen in front of me that if that's your preferred way, then please feel free to do that. Next thing is this. We are eager to be praying for you right here, right now, with whatever you have going on. And so many of you have continued to go to the website and to the app. Please continue to do that. But if in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis that our country is in, if you've been affected, then we want to pray specifically for you in that, and we want to support you and care for you as your church. So there's an email address, covidprayer@theharbor.life. You can drop an email into that 24/7 and be confident that we are praying for you and with you. So please do that at some point this week if that is you. Next thing is this, is just a simple reminder that 10 a.m. on Sunday morning is going to be a really sacred time for us as a church family. And so continue to create that rhythm for you to find that safe place where you can jump on YouTube or Facebook and join in with us in worshiping the God who is alive. And so I'm excited that we get to continue on in the service. I think Pastor Rick has an incredible message for this Easter morning that we all need. And so if you've got some paper or a pen or your favorite note-taking device, get that ready and let's join in.
This is Good Friday. I'm standing in Fairview Cemetery in League City. It's a fairly small cemetery. There are about 1,200 or so grave sites behind me. It's an old cemetery. If you look back way off in this corner, there's a gravestone of someone who was born in 1806. Our country was 30 years old when they were born. A little bit closer, there's a gravestone of someone born in 1834, before the Battle of the Alamo was ever fought. But there's some new graves as well. I've seen some graves in the last 2 or 3 years here. In fact, there's a grave being dug this very day. You're probably wondering why I'm standing here. It is Good Friday. Around the globe, followers of Jesus are remembering back to the day of Jesus' death and burial. So in one sense, it seems like the appropriate place to be in a cemetery on Good Friday. But the truth is, I've come here many times. Many times I'm running in this part of League City, in Old League City, and often I will turn down Kansas Street, which is just in front of me, and run down Kansas Street just to run through this cemetery. I'm standing in this gravel road that circles the small cemetery, and I'll often come and run through it. But not only that, I've come and I have just walked among the graves here. And if you're someone who has attended the Harbor, you've actually heard many messages from me that have been shaped and formed and written right here in this cemetery. Cemeteries are places of death and loss and sadness and grief, and I understand that. The 2 days of my deepest grief have been in a cemetery in deep South Texas. And each of those days, I stood before a fresh grave. I understand that. But I come because of an experience I had 28 years ago. And I'll tell you about that, but the experience would mean nothing to you unless I first go back in time. And I tell you about a time when there was a death, a burial, and an empty grave. We know that Jesus would spend the early years of his adulthood working as a carpenter. And at the age of 30, he stepped out from behind the carpenter's bench and began to reveal himself as being the Messiah, as being the very Son of God. And so Mark takes the first 8 chapters of his gospel and begins to lay out the different ways that Jesus did that. And there are many miracles that he speaks of. One of the first ones is Peter's mother-in-law has a high fever. And in those days, that could mean death. And so Peter brings Jesus in, and Jesus simply heals her on the spot. And there's this immediate healing that takes place then. Unfolding then will be there's a person who is lame, and Jesus gives them the ability to walk. There's one who's blind. He gives them the ability to see. One who's deaf, who gives the ability to hear. There's one who is dead, and he raises back to life again. He does miracle after miracle after miracle. Then he does miracles in the created realm as well. There's a time he walks on water. There's a time he has 5,000 men in front of him, plus women and children. He's been teaching, and their stomachs are growling, they're hungry. He takes a small bit of food. He takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he multiplies the food. And the thousands upon thousands eat to the filling point. And then they collect 12 baskets that are left over, miracle after miracle after miracle. And then Mark also points out that there's a time where Jesus is baptized, and God the Father from heaven audibly speaks and says, "This is my beloved Son who gives me so much joy." So heaven itself speaks and says, he is the Son of God. And then Mark records numerous times where Jesus is casting out demons, and the very demons of hell are announcing, this is the Son of God. So heaven and hell are announcing he's the Son of God. The miracles are announcing he's the Son of God for 8 chapters. 8 chapters gets you to exactly the halfway point of Mark. There are 16 chapters in Mark. At the end of chapter 8, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And the evidence is clear. It's just been this cascade of miracles. And Peter speaks up and says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God." For the first time then, Jesus says to them, this is the plan. This is why I've come. He says, the time is coming that I'll be arrested and I'll be killed, but I will come back to life again on the 3rd day. It's incomprehensible to Peter and the others, and it says that Peter then says to Jesus, this cannot be, this cannot happen. In fact, Matthew records that Peter actually calls Jesus Lord and then reprimands Jesus and tells him how it should be. Peter cannot conceive of the fact that Jesus would die. Jesus would tell his followers repeatedly, the time is coming that I will die, that's why I've come, but on the 3rd day I will rise again. I think they must have thought this had to be another parable. He taught often in parables. This had to be a parable because they could not imagine the fact that he would die. What they were missing was they could not imagine how bad their sin was. They could not imagine that it would take the death of the Son of God to pay the penalty for their sin. They couldn't imagine how bad their sin was. And they couldn't imagine how much God loved them. They couldn't imagine God would be willing to give the life of his Son out of love for them. It's true for you and me today. I find when I reflect on my sin or our sin, any reference point other than Jesus' death falls far short of how bad my sin, our sin is. Any reference point other than Jesus' death falls far short of how great God's love is for us. They could not imagine that. Finally, they're making the last trip to Jerusalem. Jesus is leading the way. It says his face is set like flint. This is the purpose for which he's come. The disciples are lingering behind, filled with fear and anguish. The Thursday night comes. Jesus is arrested. On Friday morning at 9 o'clock, he's nailed to a cross. Most of the women that followed Jesus are there to witness it. Some, if not all, the disciples there to witness it. For 6 hours in anguish, he hangs on the cross. At 3 o'clock, he dies. He breathes his last and dies. He's taken down from the cross and he's taken to a grave and laid in a grave just before sunset. It's been a day of death and burial. But for Jesus' followers, they are drowning in a sea of sadness and sorrow. With Jesus' death has come the death of hope for them. Their sadness and sorrow and grief are beyond our comprehension. Saturday unfolds its Sabbath, and in their culture and in their faith, it was a time of silence and stillness. Hardly anyone moved. Sunday morning, the sun comes up, and some of the women are taking some spices to properly anoint Jesus' dead body. They get to the grave, and to their surprise, the grave is empty. And they're convinced the only logical explanation is that someone has come and stolen the body. And so that's what they express. But there's this angel that explains to them it's simply what Jesus said again and again. He said, I will rise from the dead. The angel says he has simply risen from the dead. The grave is empty. That morning, Jesus would show himself first to Mary Magdalene and then to the others. He would show himself that afternoon to two followers who were walking 7 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus. He would show himself to them with skin on. Later that day, he would show himself to his disciples in an upper room. He would show himself to them. As the days would unfold for 40 days, he would show his risen self to them over and over again, to as many as 500 people at one time. The grave, friends, was empty. It was empty. To those that saw him, there's some striking things that we can see about them. One is how joy-filled they were. Words cannot begin to capture the joy that they knew in knowing Jesus' grave was empty, knowing he had risen from the dead. And then they couldn't stop telling people about his resurrection. They simply couldn't, or they wouldn't stop telling people that he had risen from the dead, and that they could one day rise from the dead as well, just as Jesus had done. In fact, history would show that the disciples would be severely persecuted. Indeed, oral history says all but one would be executed because they wouldn't stop proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. It had profoundly altered their lives and their eternities. I've wondered, though, if any of them ever went back to the empty tomb. If any of them ever went back to the place where death was defeated, where eternity was altered. I think that I would have. I think I would have gone back probably more than once. I would have gone back to a grave site which should have had the stench of death. And I would have stood there and reflected upon how that grave is an empty grave. And I think if I had inhaled deeply enough, I just might have breathed in the very fragrance of heaven itself.
I promised to tell you about an experience I had 28 years ago. In the summer of 1992, we lived in Kentucky. We made the 1,400-mile trip to deep South Texas to visit my parents. Had a week or maybe longer. I know it was the longest vacation we had had with them since I had left home after college. Had a fantastic time with them. We traveled back to Kentucky, and a few short days later, we got a call from my dad informing us that my mother had very suddenly passed away. The 1,400-mile trip home was a blur. The time of preparation on the funeral was all a blur. I remember standing at the gravesite, deep emotions, deep sense of loss, of going through my mind in rapid fire were all the things that would not happen again, all the things lost, and all the sadness that would come with that. And yet while I was standing there, I thought about my mother's deep faith in Jesus, this profound, unwavering faith that lasted a lifetime for her. And I thought about what Jesus said in John 11:25, when he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. And I found myself being hit by that truth and thinking about the one who said it, the one who died and was buried and has an empty grave, and thought about my mother's reality and recognized that for her the story was a death, a burial, yet an empty grave as well. And I found myself standing there at a level never before, breathing in the fragrance of heaven, the sweet fragrance of heaven, and this deep gratitude for the reality of heaven as I stood there at her gravesite. 2 years would pass, and my father would suddenly, tragically die. We'd be back in the very same cemetery. Just a few feet over, there's now a fresh grave.
And I'm standing there and reflecting about my father's life and thinking of his deep, profound faith in Jesus, and unwavering faith his entire adult life, and thinking about, in the midst of the sadness of the loss and the grief of losing him, sensing again that I could take in the fragrance of heaven there, because his story was a death, a burial, and an empty grave. Since then, I've thought about what Paul would write in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10. He would say, our hearts ache, yet we're filled with joy. That was my experience there. So why do I come back to this cemetery again and again? Well, for one, when I walk among the graves, it's clear that as I pass the graves, there's a date of birth and there's a date of death. And it's a reminder for me that life is short. I know my date of birth, and there will be a date of death. And I want to enjoy it and to savor it and to make it count, to make it matter. But even more than that, when I'm here among the graves, I think back and I think about Jesus' story is death, burial, and empty grave. And because of the faith that I have in him, I know that's my story too. As I walk among the graves, I can inhale the fragrance of heaven here like no other place. And then I'm reminded as I walk among these graves that everyone that I know and love and everyone I ever encounter, they too have a date of birth and they will have a date of death. And their story could be the story of a death, a burial, and an empty tomb. It could be that. In fact, as I'm speaking now, you are most likely sitting on Easter Sunday. You're participating in this service right now. And many of you in this service, you know, you have this profound faith in Jesus. You've trusted him to forgive your sins. You've trusted him to lead your lives. And you know that your story, your legacy will be that of a death, a burial, and an empty grave. And you should take in the fragrance of heaven on this Easter celebration. But I know too, there are many of you that are part of this crowd, and you're aware you have never trusted Christ. You've never said authentically, please forgive me, Jesus, of my sins. I will trust you to do that. Please lead my life. I will begin to follow. Your story right now is just the story of Good Friday. I'm standing in Good Friday. I'm standing in the story of death and a burial. And your story right now then is just simply, there'll be a death and there'll be a burial. That is your story. But you're sitting in Easter right now. And you're sitting in the day of resurrection. You're sitting in the day of the empty grave. And this could be your day to simply, profoundly respond to what Jesus has already done for you. And say to him, Jesus, would you forgive my sins? I need you to forgive them. Would you lead my life? And in that moment, your story changes. Your story will be a death, a burial, and an empty grave. I would invite you to join in the celebration that's about to accelerate even more and celebrate what Jesus has done with the empty grave.
Come on, church, let's celebrate together. Sing, I was buried. I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my
Friends, it is such an honor that you would join us for this Easter celebration. My hope in my heart is that you are filled with joy on this morning and that you are celebrating the risen Lord, the one whose grave is empty. And my hope and prayer is that one day your grave will be empty as well. If this was the day that you said to Jesus, please forgive me, please lead my life, then eternity has been altered for you. One day your grave will be empty. And if that's been true for you today, please email me so I can celebrate that with you. Next Sunday at 10, we'll be gathering again, and I would invite you to come back and join us. As a church, we're in a series called Meet Me in the Pages. This next week as a church, we'll be reading the Gospel of John, chapters 3 through 7. And so I would encourage you to read those chapters, and next Sunday at 10, I'll be teaching out of that. And so I hope all of you can join us again on next Sunday. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for your deep, deep love for us. Thank you both for the cross and for the empty grave. And thank you for the deep impact upon our lives. We worship you and praise you and celebrate you with all we are. In Jesus' name, amen.
Come on, we're not done dancing this morning.